My name is Victor. If you are also over 65 or approaching that threshold, I want you to sit with something that very few people in the financial world will say to your face directly. The strategy that served you for 40 years, save more, stay conservative, never touch the principal, was built for a completely different chapter of life. It was built for someone who is still gathering. You are no longer gathering. You have gathered. And clinging to the logic of accumulation when you have entered the phase of distribution is not wisdom. It is the single most expensive mistake made by responsible, disciplined people at your stage of life. I want to walk through exactly what I mean because this is not theoretical. This is happening right now in the accounts of millions of people who believe they are doing everything right. People who saved faithfully for decades. People who are sitting on retirement accounts that feel secure and are being silently eroded year after year in ways that will not become visible until the damage is already severe. Let me start with inflation because it is the enemy no one names correctly, not the number that appears on a government report. The real inflation you actually experience: groceries, utility bills, healthcare, prescription medications, home repairs, insurance premiums. For those of us over 65, the actual cost inflation is substantially higher than the headline figure because our spending patterns are weighted toward categories that have inflated far faster than the general index. Healthcare inflation in particular has run at 2 to 3 times the general rate for the better part of 2 decades. When you account for what it genuinely costs to maintain your standard of living, not the abstracted average of all consumers, but your specific life, the purchasing power erosion is far more severe than what most people are told to plan for. Now hold that number next to what your money is actually earning. If your savings sit in a traditional bank savings account, a money market fund, or a conservative bond ladder, your nominal return might be 2, 3, or perhaps 4% per year. Subtract the real inflation you are experiencing, and in many scenarios your real return is 0 or negative, which means every single year, in terms of what your money can actually buy, you are quietly losing ground. The balance on the screen may stay flat or even nudge upward in nominal terms, but the purchasing power behind that number is shrinking. This is what I call the comfort illusion, the false security of a number that looks fine, while the reality behind it quietly deteriorates. Years ago, I knew a man who had built a successful career and retired at 67 with close to $2 million spread across certificates of deposit and savings accounts. By any conventional measure, he was comfortable. He had no debt. His advisor told him he was in excellent shape. By his mid-70s, the cost of maintaining exactly the same life had risen dramatically, while his return had not kept pace. He had not made a single reckless decision. He had not speculated. He had followed exactly the advice he was given. And yet the purchasing power of his retirement had been quietly consumed by a decade of inflation his portfolio was never designed to survive. He was not broke, but he was meaningfully poorer in real terms than he had been on the day he retired, and he had done everything right. The shift I am asking you to make is foundational. It is the move from an accumulation mindset to a deployment mindset. In the accumulation phase, the goal is to gather capital, defer consumption, and let compound growth do its work. That is correct and disciplined thinking for someone in their 30s or 40s. But you are not in your 30s. The compound growth has happened. The capital exists. The question is no longer how to make the pile bigger. The question is how to make it work. And those are profoundly different questions with profoundly different answers. Making capital work is a fundamentally different operation than keeping capital safe. It means putting money into assets that generate income, reliable, consistent, inflation-resistant income, not speculation, not chasing yield in corners of the market that offer high returns precisely because they carry unacceptable risk. I am talking about a deliberate, structured strategy of deploying capital into income-producing assets with established histories and predictable behavior across economic cycles. The first and most underutilized of these strategies is dividend income from financially durable, established businesses. not speculative high-yield plays, not companies offering outsized dividends because their stock price has collapsed and the math forces the yield number upward. I am talking about businesses that have grown their dividend payment consistently for decades, companies with long records of raising their payouts every year, through recessions, through market corrections, through every variety of economic disruption. These businesses exist across every major sector of the economy. They are not exciting. They do not make headlines for doubling in value overnight. But they do something no savings account can do. They deliver growing income over time. The dividend payment you receive 3 years from today, if those companies perform as they historically have, will be meaningfully higher than what you receive today. This is a structural hedge against inflation, income that rises as the cost of living rises, rather than a fixed nominal payment that loses ground every year. The second income mechanism is real estate, and I want to address this clearly because many people associate it exclusively with the burden of being a landlord. You do not need to own or manage properties to access real estate income. Real estate investment trusts allow you to own a fractional share of professionally managed commercial real estate portfolios, medical office buildings, senior housing facilities, logistics centers, apartment complexes. These structures are legally required to distribute the vast majority of their rental income to shareholders. The income they generate is tied to rent, which has a meaningful long-term correlation to inflation. As the cost of living rises, so does the income from these holdings, a fundamentally different dynamic than fixed-rate savings instruments that remain frozen while the world around them inflates. The third concept, and perhaps the most important for those whose primary concern is outliving their money, is the income floor. Think of it as a baseline of guaranteed, predictable monthly income that covers your essential living expenses regardless of what the market does on any given day or month. Social Security typically forms the foundation of this floor. If you have a pension, that adds to it. Some people complement this foundation with guaranteed income annuities, contracts with insurance companies that exchange a lump sum for a guaranteed lifetime monthly payment. The goal is to reach a state where your non-negotiable monthly income covers your non-negotiable monthly expenses without requiring you to liquidate any investment. Once that floor is established, the rest of your portfolio can be invested with patience and a longer time horizon, because you are no longer dependent on it for day-to-day survival. The anxiety that drives people to keep too much in cash dissolves when the floor is secure. I need to spend some time on something that receives far too little attention, and that is the psychological dimension of this transition. People who have been disciplined savers for 40 years carry a deep, nearly visceral resistance to the idea of deploying or spending assets. There is an identity wrapped around the act of saving. There is a feeling of control in watching numbers grow. There is a conditioned fear, not entirely irrational, that spending today means vulnerability tomorrow. And that psychology, which served you powerfully during the accumulation phase, becomes a genuine liability during the distribution phase. The programming does not simply switch off on the day you retire. I have observed this pattern more times than I can count. People with far more than enough resources who restrict themselves unnecessarily, not because the numbers demand it, but because decades of saving psychology have calcified into a fear response that no longer serves them. And the tragic irony is that by keeping capital in low-yield accounts instead of deploying it productively, they are actually creating the vulnerability they fear. They are ensuring that inflation erodes their purchasing power year after year in the name of caution. The perceived safety is a kind of slow destruction dressed in conservative clothing. There is also the matter of the 4% withdrawal rule, because it is cited so frequently that many people treat it as a law rather than what it actually is, a guideline derived from specific historical data under conditions that do not fully replicate today's environment. The original research examined a specific portfolio composition over a specific historical period. Bond yields are different now. Longevity has extended. Healthcare costs have structurally outpaced general inflation for 2 decades. And the study was conducted using nominal returns, meaning it did not fully address the real purchasing power erosion across a 30-year retirement. Treating this guideline as a reliable guarantee is a risk in itself. More fundamentally, the 4% rule assumes that your spending is roughly consistent year after year. In reality, retirement spending follows a pattern that does not fit a straight line. In the early years, the active years, spending tends to be highest. You are traveling. You are engaging in experiences you deferred for decades. Your health is sufficient to participate fully. Then comes a period of gradual moderation, and eventually mobility limitations reduce certain categories of spending, while healthcare costs rise to fill and often exceed the gap. A static percentage applied to a dynamic human life is not a retirement strategy. It is a mathematical simplification that ignores the actual arc of how people live. What a more honest distribution plan looks like is one that accounts for this arc deliberately. It front-loads some discretionary spending in the years when you can genuinely enjoy and benefit from it. It maintains the income floor through the middle and later years when healthcare begins to dominate the budget. And it holds a specific reserve for the long-term care contingency, a real and statistically significant expense that more than half of people over 65 will face in some form before the end of their lives. Planning for this is not pessimism. It is the highest form of realism. Let me also address the specific arithmetic of what I call the opportunity cost of idle capital, because I think it deserves to be stated plainly. When you hold $200,000 in a savings account generating 2% per year, and a thoughtfully constructed income portfolio could generate 4.5% to 5%, including both income distributions and modest capital appreciation, the annual difference on that amount alone is approximately $5,000. Over 10 years, accounting for reinvestment and compounding, that difference does not simply add up linearly, it compounds. The cumulative difference between deployed capital and idle capital over the span of a retirement is often staggering, not in any single dramatic moment, but in the quiet accumulation of years when money did not work as hard as it could have. I want to be completely clear about the distinction I am drawing. I am not suggesting reckless speculation. I am not suggesting you eliminate liquid reserves or chase yield in sectors of the market you do not understand. What I am suggesting is that the spectrum between a savings account and a high-risk gamble is far wider than binary thinking tends to allow. The genuinely productive territory, dividend-paying equities with long track records, real estate income structures, guaranteed income instruments, sits comfortably within the responsible range. The obstacle is not the risk. The obstacle is the psychology. It is the 40-year conditioning that equates motion with danger and stillness with safety at a stage of life where the opposite is increasingly true. Here is what I want you to understand about sequence of returns risk, because it is one of the most underappreciated forces in retirement planning. The order in which market returns occur matters enormously when you are drawing down assets. If the early years of your retirement coincide with a significant market decline, and you are selling shares to fund your living expenses during that decline, the damage is not simply proportional to the percentage drop. You are selling depressed assets to meet expenses, reducing the number of shares that can participate in the eventual recovery. The portfolio never fully recovers its original trajectory. This is why having an income floor, guaranteed income that requires no asset liquidation, is not merely comforting, it is structurally protective. When the floor covers your needs, a market downturn becomes something you watch, rather than something you are forced to sell into. The reason I speak about this with such directness is that I have spent enough years watching well-intentioned people follow well-intentioned advice that was simply designed for a different chapter of life. The financial system, as it was built, rewards the accumulation phase. Products are designed for it. Advice is built around it. The distribution phase, the actual reason you spent 4 decades accumulating, has historically been an afterthought. which means it falls to you to think about it with the same rigor and intentionality you brought to getting here. Your money waited patiently while you built your career. It deferred. It compounded quietly. It endured market cycles and economic crises and came through because you stayed disciplined. Now it has arrived at the moment it was built for. The question is whether you will manage it like someone still preparing for a future that is now your present, or whether you will deploy it with the same clarity and purpose that built it in the first place. After 65, the act of hoarding capital is not discipline. It is the failure to complete what discipline began. Put it to work.